Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 75 of my game system design series of videos. In this video I'll cover how to classify morale for Napoleonic troops. Or to put it another way, what morale should I allocate to this specific troop type when I'm attempting to create a historical scenario. In my last video of this series, I covered the topic of refreshing and updating old sets of rules, which is a project I've been engaged in. I have recently refreshed and updated an old set of ancient rules from the 1980s, which was completed successfully. In that specific set of rules, I used DBMM army lists and troop types, which meant I did not have to worry about creating army lists or classifying troop morales or quality types. My next project was to complete the refreshing of an old WRG Wargaming rules, or set of rules, titled Wargaming Rules 1685 to 1845, which is almost complete and ready for playtesting. However, one issue I did have was troop morale. With WRG, it was only a minor issue, as WRG does not use a wide range of troop types. But it was an issue, and I wondered how much worse this would be if the rules used a wider range of different morale classes. The specific issue that I grappled with was, what should a specific troop type's morale be for a specific period of time or battle? It made me think, how do you classify the morales of different troop types? Is it pure gut feel, or is there some science behind it? As a starting point, let's look at the WRG definition of troop type morale for the Napoleonic period. WRG first defines all troops as regular and irregular, which on the surface seems reasonably straightforward. As almost all troops end up being regular in a typical game, the irregular classification is almost irrelevant, although it does occasionally crop up. The next classification is morale, starting with the elite morale. The elite morale includes both guards and grenadiers, which in many ways is not really that much of an issue. These are troops which are physically large or very well equipped and with a high sense of their superiority and loyalty to their unit. The next class is veteran. The veteran class are basically men who have experienced a lot of action, with the key point being a lot of successful action. They have their advantages and disadvantages compared with elites, and I feel this is a good classification. Let's look at trained, and there are no surprises here. The bulk of all troops you would expect are trained. The one unusual issue I have is in most WRG army lists, troops such as cuirassiers are normally in this morale class, which is trained. I would have thought a lavishly equipped troop type such as cuirassiers would be more in the elite than trained zone, which does seem like a bit of an issue in my mind. For dragoons and light cavalry, setting the morale as trained may be reasonable, but cuirassiers, and in some cases hussars, tend to be of a higher morale class. The next class is raw. The raw classification is also reasonable, although I feel there is a difference between a well-trained unit which has never seen action, which would be my idea of raw troops, compared with simply badly trained or not trained troops. WRG breaks up morale by regular and irregular. What we've covered is the regular morale classes. We're going to move into the irregular morale classes. And the first one is fanatics, which is reasonably self-explanatory. The next class is something called soldier, which I must admit did confuse me a lot. The soldier class is interesting. I would have not considered Jager as irregulars, although it does state 7-Year War specifically, and the WRG army list normally classes Jager as regular trained or veteran, so maybe this is something unique to the 7-Year War period. But nonetheless, soldiers are a rather interesting class. What does this actually really mean? It seems like these are trained troops that happen to be not trained to operate in a formal manner, like lining up and marching and things of this nature. The next class is warrior. The warrior class does make sense when refighting colonial campaigns, let's say in Africa and India, so I can understand why they would have it, although I would expect that this would not be that common in Europe. Although maybe in Egypt it would be common when Napoleon went down, and if there was any conflicts between the Ottomans and Russians or whatever. Finally, we come to something called the levy class. The levy class is something which always throws me. In my mind, a levy is someone with no training and minimal equipment formed into a horde-like formation, which this class does include, and I suppose you could say these are irregular troops. However, I never considered artillery drivers and crew as levy-type troops. I must admit, in some armies, the artillery were crewed by civilians in the early war period, but this was changed by 1813-14 at least, if not earlier, and most artillery crew became professional soldiers. I feel this does seem like a very wide and vague troop type. The other weird thing about this is that in many ways, this is the typical morale class that fits below raw. While I like many of the classifications and definitions and the ideas behind it, we are dealing with an awful lot of subjectivity here. On the other hand, this is such a simple system that you can assume all troops are trained unless there is a specific reason to set it otherwise. This is certainly what I assumed when I started using these rules many years ago, although I did not initially possess any army list, and when you look at the army list, it seems to indicate otherwise. Let's start looking at an army list, specifically looking at the Napoleonic Austrians. If we look at this, the Grenadiers, the top line, are elite, which I suppose makes sense. Now we come to the line infantry, and in this list, most of the line infantry are raw, which I do find rather strange. In other army lists, certain regiments at different times are considered as inferior, so this could represent those regiments, but there is an awful lot of them in this army list. When we look at the Freikorps, they are considered raw, and I suppose that seems reasonable. Now we come to the artillery, or the levy artillery, which may be true for the early campaigns, but not for the later campaigns. I'm uncertain what the logic is here, but it seems common for a number of other nationalities as well. My gut feeling is these army lists are designed for competition play, and they wanted to restrict certain artillery-based tactics for some of the nationalities, in order to provide some variety or for historical reasons. The number of crew for many non-French nationality artillery is also rather low, going as low as 3 crew per element in some cases, and with only 1 pair of horses and a single driver in also some rare cases. When we look at the French, we can get up to 6 crew, and we always get at least 2 pairs of horses and 2 drivers. Now we come to the trained line infantry, which are certainly not in the majority here. Once again, several other army lists do change the morale rating for certain regiments during certain periods or battles, but clearly in these lists, trained is not the default morale for line infantry, at least for the Austrians. Let's compare the Austrian line infantry with the French line infantry. The French have several army lists, so I'll use the Grande Armée list in this case. We can see the French get some veteran line infantry, which is reasonable, as these troops may have been the troops involved at Marengo or Hohenlinden, which makes them, or which would have made them, veteran. Once again, in many other army lists, some specific regiments are considered as possessing higher than normal morale or experience. This could represent those regiments, and as a result, I think is very historical. However, when we look at the other line infantry, it does look like the French get a lot of raw line infantry as well. Again, I get caught up with the word raw, which does have a specific meaning, and I'm not sure if my understanding of the word aligns with what WRG intended. I think WRG has this issue as well in their later ancient rules, and they replace this style of morale naming with a simple superior, ordinary and inferior classification, which avoids this kind of misunderstanding. I personally feel raw classification here really means simply inferior classification. Finally, we get to the trained infantry, of which there is a good number, certainly a better situation for the French than the Austrians, which you would expect in the Napoleonic French Grande Armée. Another point, raised before, is these are army lists designed for competition play. Low morale means we get brittle armies which fall apart easier, thus ensuring short games. This could be a factor here, as these army lists are not designed to assist gamers in creating historical scenarios. They are designed for competition play. Let's do a bit of a comparison. What we see here is a reasonable comparison between the French and Austrians. While the Austrians lack veterans, this can be understood. The Austrians can still field 2 to 8 units of trained line infantry, which for a competition game is a reasonable force mix. Remember, most comp games are about 1,500 points. After doing this comparison, I cannot help but feel the morale naming should really be superior, ordinary, inferior, which would feel a lot better than, let's say, elite, veteran, trained, and raw. But if we ignore the naming for now, this does show how the WRG morale classes is designed to work. This is also a good comparison between the French and Austrians, as you would expect for a competition army set of rules. However, I did have another concern. My other concern was the morale grading of some of the cavalry, specifically cuirassiers. As we can see here, the French also get trained cuirassiers, so this matches up with the Austrian trained cuirassiers. But once again, I'm not certain if trained fits with cuirassiers, and they should be classed at something higher. As there is no morale class between elite and trained, apart from veteran, which does require a specific battlefield experience, I understand why they default to trained. Perhaps guard should be in their classification, and cuirassier could be classed as elite. But even without this extra morale class, I feel cuirassiers should be elite, even in the WRG classification. After all, grenadiers are classed as elite. Why not cuirassiers? This is a personal opinion only, so putting that to one side, this classification does align with the Austrians very well, and you do get balanced army list if you're playing in a competition game. After some analysis, I have no issue with this troop type morale classification as long as the point system is accurate, which to the best of my knowledge it reasonably is. Regardless, this classification of the troop types is the opinion of the author of the army list I'm using, which in this case is Bruce Cronin. Coupled with that is that these lists are designed for competition play, which may not align with creating historical scenarios. I wonder if this aligns, or how this aligns, with other rules army lists. Let's take a look. When I looked at a range of other army lists, I came up with an interesting problem. My serious Napoleonic gaming uses Bloody Big Battles and the Age of Eagles, and these rules do not possess army lists specifically. Both rules are focused on recreating historical battles. This is expected, considering their scale and their objective, but it means I cannot use these rules to assist me in creating a guide of troop type morales for the Napoleonic period, or at least I didn't think so initially. Let's look at the morale classification system using these rules, starting with Bloody Big Battle. There are veteran, which have experience, extra training or are generally superior, trained, which are your standard ordinary troops, and raw, which are troops which lack training, equipment, and experience. Factored in there is command control, officers and other intangibles. So you get 3 classifications. This is a good classification system when you're refighting entire battles. Bloody Big Battles is focused on the battles of the 19th century, so they do differ from the Napoleonic period a bit, but the basic system is perfectly serviceable and aligns with the objective of the rules. I could go to a historical scenario to see what different troops were classified, but this varies so much by scenario, it's not possible for me to come up with any general rules which cover the entire Napoleonic period. The scenarios are created based on orders of battle, and the morales tend to be adjusted until the battle is balanced. This is a good system, and I like it, but alas, it does not assist me in this particular case. When I looked at the Age of Eagles, which also don't contain any army list, I thought I'd have the same issue. But let's look at the morale system. This morale system also uses 3 grades, elite, regular, and conscript, which once again is a very good simple system considering the objective of these rules. I thought for a moment I would end up in a similar situation as Bloody Big Battles, but very good, which was very good for me, these rules have a scenario creation guide, which does provide morale values by troop types to assist players in creating historical scenarios. While I like historical scenario-based rules and do not need army lists for a competition game, I do need some guidelines for the creation of scenarios, and these rules give it to me. So these rules can be used in my analysis. Without going into too much details on the other rules I am looking at, the two additional rules I had army lists for were Garde du Corps and Empire 3rd Edition. Both these rules have an extensive army list with more quality values. I suspect because these rules did have a competition game focus as well, but they also had a historical battle focus, so we get into a very good balance with these particular rules. When we drill down into the rules in more detail, Garde du Corps uses 7 different morale grades, which are zealous, elite, veteran, average, poor, conscript, and undisciplined. These are normally referred to by a letter ranging from A to G. The percentage values represent the chance of these troop types failing a morale test. When we look at Empire 3rd Edition, we see that Empire 3rd Edition has a massive 10 different morale grades. While I'm not a fan of so many morale grades, it does give me an idea of the ranking of different troop types within a general morale grade if I want to compare, let's say, two seemingly similar troop types. Both Empire 3rd Edition and Garde du Corps come from a different era, one where players rarely command more than a corps, and most likely only divisions, and the micro detail of individual units was important to these rules. You do not see this level of any fine detail anymore, as it's difficult to understand what benefit it actually provides. But in this case, it does give me a good detail guide for my analysis. I often find when trying to create a simple system, it's best to start with a complex one and then simplify it. As an example, if you grade all your troops into 10 levels and then divide these values to give you a final 3 levels of morale, you can at least justify your classification, as well as being sometimes surprised. Other rules that I looked at, such as Shaco, does have a very good army list, with 5 different morale ratings provided in the army list. I may go back and add these ratings to my analysis in the future, but for the moment I was fairly happy with the rules I've already selected. Other rules which I may also consider to use in the future are Napoleon's battles, but for now, as I indicated before, I have a good range of army lists to use for my analysis. Anyway, trying to decipher the information cards from Napoleon battles would take a lot of effort, as these rules do not have a general morale value type system. Instead, every unit has a unique set of stats. This level of detail I simply do not wish to deal with, at this moment at least. Other rules which I could have used was Elan, which looks good and provides morale classes for troop types by period, which would require some analysis to convert into something I could use. I must admit I do like some aspects of it, as for example the troop class of the Württemberg army lists all as 3, that is, they're the same, from foot to cavalry. As these are all regular troops and there are no guards, this could be correct, so is interesting. In addition, Elan is in some regards the successor to the old WRG set of rules, so maybe I should go back and use these or incorporate it, but the army lists just weren't structured in the way I could easily use. Let's now look at an example. This shows French musketeers broken up by the full set of army lists I'm using. First is Age of Eagles, which contains 3 classifications. This is followed by WRG, which has 5 classifications. In this case, I'm counting Fanatic as elite, Warrior and Soldiers as train, and Levy is the lowest morale class, which gives me my 5th morale class. The next is Garde du Corps, which has 7 morale classifications, and finally Empire 3rd Edition with its 10 classifications. Before I normalise this data, let's look at how the troop types are broken up. The first thing I want to point out is how some troop types are broken up by period. In this case, Old Guard Grenadiers starts as Class A from 1803 to 1812, drops to Class B in 1813 to 1814, and then goes back up to Class A in 1815. The rules Garde du Corps seems to move the morale class around by year. Originally I did not like this, but in this case it does make sense. In 1813 to 14 the Guard was in a very poor state and was being rebuilt, along with the rest of the French army. It stands to reason the morale may have dropped during this difficult, for the French at least, period. In other cases, the change was caused by some basic change in the troop type. For example, the middle guard in this example. I'm assuming between 1803 and 1809 all the best troops were going to the old guard, thus the middle guard got the lesser quality troops. By 1910 or 1810, the quality of all troops had grown so much even the middle guard was considered as the highest grade. We see the drop between 1813 and 1814, as discussed before, and the recovery in 1815. A better example is the Portuguese line infantry, which gained in morale when the British started training it in 1808 or around. I pass no judgment on whether this is reasonable or not, but if this army list is going to be a guide for scenario construction, I need to factor these strategic factors into it. Finally, not shown here is troops which drop in morale because they're not very enthusiastic, as occurred with the Prussians and Austrians when they were allied with the French. None of the other army lists seem to take this into account. However, for some troop types, you do see the same effect occurring, especially with Prussian Landwehr in a sort of different way, but nonetheless mirroring what Garde du Corps does. Now, what occurred here is that in 1815, the Landwehr gained in morale compared with 1813 to 1814. As you could imagine, 1813, 1814, they were just being raised, so they were in a very disorganised state. By 1815, it was far more regulated, so you would understand this difference. Let's now look at the morale classes in more detail. While not perfect, we can see the morale, or the troop morale classes, at least for elite, seem to align across our 4 sets of rules. The biggest difference is when we look at the Garde du Corps values. All these values tend to be subjective, so the people who put them together may have different ideas in their brain. To try and normalise out these differences, I will calculate an average of all 4 army lists. However, in order to do this, I'll need to convert all these subjective descriptions into a number. I'm going to use percentages, or 100% as my maximum range, that is 0 to 100%, and try and convert all these values into a percentage value which fits into this range, which I can then attempt to average out. Let's start with the simplest one, which is Age of Eagles, which only contains 3 morale classifications. This gives me a value of 100% for elite, 66% for trained, and 33% for raw. Basically, if it's 0 to 33, it's raw. If it's 33 to 66, it's trained. If it's 66 to 100, it's elite. All the values are basically up to values, with the lower value being the previous morale classification value. When we look at WRG, we're dealing with 5 morale classifications. Using the same system, we end up with this arrangement. When we line it up with the Age of Eagles, we see trained in the centre, but the WRG trained is smaller, with an overlap with veteran and raw. When we increase the number of morale classifications, we get this overlap, so the better trained troops in Age of Eagle may now be considered as veteran in WRG. When we factor in Garde du Corps, we achieve a further breakdown. The morale class D is the centre class, aligned with trained, but now we have a finer breakdown of the troop types. Now, let's look at our last set of rules, Empire 3rd Edition, with its 10 morale classifications. Each morale class takes up 10% of our expanded range, as you can see here. We can now see our original trained classification is cleanly split into 2, in this case crack line and veteran line. I'd expect most regular troops during this period would have had experience and be well trained, so dividing this into 2 gives us this fine-grained detail, whether we want it or not. At the bottom we see conscript line, which could fit into trained, and at the top we have elites, which is maybe a more problematic description. It is possible the Empire 3rd Edition has far too many morale grades at the top end compared with other rules, but if we normalise all these values across all the rules, any issues, if they exist, should be minimised. This is the result of our normalisation. Let's check to see how different army lists align with each other. For Age of Eagle, or Age of Empire, elite should represent all troops which fall in the range 66% to 100%. The only issue we have here is with the veteran line, or Legionnaire, and Swiss line. The veteran line has a value of 60% using the Empire 3rd Edition army list. This is 6% outside our expected range. Personally, I feel the issue here is caused by a lack of morale grouping for Age of Empires. These rules want to show high morale line, and the only morale class available to go above is elite. I don't consider this a major issue in summary. The other issue is the Swiss line, and in this case I'm certain there is an issue with the empire classifications. I went back to my spreadsheet and did find an error which did remove this problem. Let's now look at regular troops or trained troops. I must admit there does not seem to be many regular troops in this list. However, the bulk of actual regiments would be line, so in terms of troop numbers, this is likely accurate. Game designers are clearly obsessed with the best troop types for understandable reason. Regular troops should fall into the range 33% to 67%, assuming fractions are rounded up. We only have an issue with Young Guards in 1815, which I feel is once again caused by a lack of morale classes. The rules wanted to show the reduction in quality for the Young Guards in 1815, and they only had one morale class available to drop down to. As far as I can see, there are no issues here. The last classification is conscript or raw, which should fall into the range 0% to 33%. Of all our 6 troop types, we have issues with 4. The biggest issue is with the raw line and line volunteers. This once again looks like a lack of morale classes. The designers wanted to show low morale line and only had one morale class to drop to, which is shared by a range of much lower troop morale classes. The delta is significant, but what makes me feel the issue is with Age of Eagles is all the other rules seem to align with each other reasonably closely. Only Age of Eagles seems to be out of alignment. This is of concern. However, once again, normalizing the values with our 4 army list should reduce the issue dramatically. We have now normalized the values, and this shows our normalized or average values. Let's look at elite and see how it compares with our source values. The final value should be between 66% and 100%, and they all look good. Note, I have removed the incorrect Swiss line value, giving me a value which I feel is reasonably correct. This shows a comparison of the regular or trained range, which should be between 33% and 66%. We still have our Young Guard issues when we look at Age of Eagles, but with a value of 80%, this would convert into a B morale class for Garde du Corps, which is less than its original A class and does show a drop in morale during this period, which is almost certainly historically accurate. Thus, the result is that I don't feel we have an issue here. When we look at conscripts or raw, the comparison is once again our most problematic one, as the final value should be between 0 and 33%. We still have our 4 troop type issues, but if we use the average values and look at Empire 3rd edition, all these troops would be classed as veteran line, which is lower than the standard line value of crack line. So we still do have our 1 morale class downgrade, which is historically accurate. It's just we can't really reflect it easily in Age of Empires. Saying all this is an anomalous result, and one I suspect individual players may need to correct themselves. I'm not interested in creating any of my own values. I just want a normalized value using others' rules designers' subjective opinion of the correct morale classes. One caveat. When I have no values, I'll need to add them myself. Thus, I do need to create my own values. But I'll use the values of the closest equivalent troops. As a result, I suspect, the Grenadier et Chasseurs will likely be set at a high morale level, similar to the Grenadiers above it, which in this case is 85%. Now, as a final error check, let's now reconvert our normalized averaged value into a WRG morale value. The first benefit is that we now have morale classes for all the troops not covered in our WRG army list. We can say with some confidence the morale of the Garde de Paris is raw. It may not be correct historically, but it's based on other rules, and if you want to use a different value, you will need to do your own research and correct it accordingly. We do see some changes here. The Young Guard in 1815 is now veteran. As the Young Guard is considered as elite in the WRG army list, Because there is no consideration of the year, this is across the entire period of the Napoleonic War. Thus, now we actually get a young guard which drops in quality in 1815. I personally feel this is an improvement to the army list. We do have some issues with the line volunteers and line raw, as the line is the same as standard line in this reconverted comparison. This does need to be manually corrected, so I'll need to insert a manual modifier to get it back to just raw, because I think if we're going to have a troop class of raw line, we better make sure it is raw. In this chart, I've added a manual modifier to bring these troop types back to raw just. If this is a bit annoying, this is a bit annoying, as I was hoping to have a fully automatic process, but life is never that simple. If I added other rules army sets, this may go away, but as long as manual modification is minimal, I can live with this. When we look at artillery, we do get a lot of changes. All the other rules seem to imply the French artillery had a high morale, and once we add these opinions into our equation, our artillery grows up in morale value to veteran and elite. The other army lists also go up, although not as high as the French. The WRG army lists do allocate a lot of crew to French guns, so perhaps WRG reflects this advantage in terms of crew rather than morale. It's hard to know, but I don't consider this a major problem because all the other rules seem to align. It's only WRG that seems to be out. When we look at line infantry, Jager and skirmishers, the WRG morale classifications remain identical. Even the raw line, or the raw lights, are raw, although they do not exist in the WRG army list that I'm using, but if I call them raw lights, then it's good that they're raw. When we look at cavalry, we see a lot of changes or differences similar to the artillery. The WRG army list seemed to give cavalry a rather low morale rating across the board. I never really understood this, as I would have expected, let's say, a cuirassier would have a very high opinion of himself and his equipment. All the other rules seem to agree with this impression as well. So, due to the other rules, the morale of, let's say, the heavy cavalry or cuirassiers go up, and even other cavalry too. We do also see a bump in morale of the good quality cavalry experienced between 1810 and 1812, and this is reflected in these new values. I personally don't see any issues with this, but others may. Finally, we come to the light cavalry and we see the same effect as well. The original classified cavalry as elite are all the same, they're elite, but most of the trained cavalry have moved up to veteran status. Once again, I do not personally see any issues with this, but some die-hard WRG comp gamers may object. As all the other rules do align with this final result, those gamers may not object as much to these changes. While I feel this is the correct approach, what I'm showing you now is not perfect and has at least two major issues. The first one is I have classed WRG morale into 5 levels. The first 4 are regular and the last irregular. This is not the morale levels WRG officially uses. WRG uses 4 levels of reg and 4 levels of irregular. This has caused some issues with my morale gradings, and I'll have to go back and change it after I give it a full analysis to ensure it does not cause any other issues. So basically, I will need to adjust the WRG morale ranking from 5 to 4. The second issue is basically to do with the maths. I've broken up all the rules morales into a range. So for example, trained in this example has a range of 33% to 66%. However, simplicity, I have given this troop morale a value of 66%, which is the highest value in the full range. It really should be set to a midpoint, or 50% in this example. The reason why this is an issue is when I convert back from a percentage to a morale grade, I use the entire range of 33% to 66%. If all the rules use the same number of morale grades, then this would not be an issue, but I'm dealing with morale ranges of between 3 and 10, so it is likely causing an issue, something else I'll have to adjust. I could go on with my analysis, but as this video is long enough, I will end the video now. In summary, the exercise has been fruitful, and I'll be using the results to ensure my army lists for the rules I currently use per my fast play version of WRG, Grosse Schlachten and other rules, have army lists which reflect something that other designers would agree with. I find guessing morale grades for troop types, especially Napoleonic troop types, frustrating and exhausting, and creating a solution which is as automatic as possible is a holy grail, which I think I've got very close to achieving in this case. And so we come to an end of episode 75 of my video series on game system design, in this case looking at Napoleonic troop type morale classifications. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.